Hello and welcome. My name is Carolina Kaufman, and I'm the Director of Education Engagement here at the Pentacrest Museums. We are delighted to welcome you to our Exhibition Spotlight program, If Walls Could Talk, which is a companion program to our current exhibit, Then and Now, 175 years on the Pentacrest. It's currently on exhibit at the Old Capitol Museum, honoring the university's landmark anniversary and examining through multiple lenses the evolution and significance of the Pentacrest, the heart of the University of Iowa and Iowa City. Serving to strengthen the vital role of both museums in educational research and engagement missions of the university, the Pentacrest Museums enhance the campus-wide focus on cultural and environmental diversity. That said, we commemorate the most celebrated building at the University of Iowa, the Old Capitol. It is important to reflect and remember what this land has meant to people over the course of history, in society, and as humans long before the Old Capitol was built. This map is one example to bring greater historical perspective into our goals at the Pentacrest Museums and the University of Iowa, to acknowledge the lands we stand on as the homelands of the Chippewa, Iowa, Kickapoo, Menominee, Miami, Missouri, Omaha, Osage, Otoe, Ottawa, Ponca, Potawatomi, Meskwaki, Sauk, and Fox, the affiliated tribes, and the Ho-Chunk Winnebago nations. The following tribal nations: the Omaha tribe of Nebraska, Ponca tribe of Nebraska, the Meskwaki, Sauk, and Fox of the Mississippi of Iowa, and the Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribes of Nebraska nations, continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them. As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847. Consistent with the University of Iowa's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experience of Native peoples will help inform the work we do, and the collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment, and retentions efforts acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations. To learn more, you can visit the following sites. And in that reflection, this is a great introduction to our program today. This illustrated document called the 1837 Iowa Map, or No Heart Map, was named after the Iowa leader who presented to the US government in 1837. The map, designed to persuade several Midwestern tribes to agree to land secessions and new treaties, serves as an illustrated history of the Iowa people between 1600 and 1837, depicting the villages and travel routes plotted on lakes and rivers within an area of nearly 250,000 square miles of the upper Midwest and Eastern Great Plains. And this postcard image of Iowa, of the Iowa River, gives you an idea of what Iowa City used to look like before settlement. I'm excited to now present our panel today. We have with us Liz Crooks. Liz has served as the director of the University of Iowa Pentacrest Museum since 2018 and holds an MA in Museum Studies and a graduate certificate in Book Arts. Born and raised in Iowa City, Crooks developed a passion for museums while visiting the museums she now oversees. She serves on numerous campus advisory committees, including the Museum Studies Certificate Program. Tim Weitzel earned a master's degree in anthropology at the University of Iowa and has assisted local governments in building evaluations, architectural history, and history on a statewide basis. Locally, he has performed research for the City of Iowa City and the University Heights, and is interested in local Iowa history. We're excited to bring them in today, and now I'm excited to pass on the mic to Liz Crooks.
Let me get my mute. You would think after 2 years with Zoom, I'd be better at this. I want to start by saying thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I can't tell you how excited I've been for this presentation. It involves so many of my favorite things and my favorite people. And it also represents the first time that despite living in the same neighborhood, despite having shared passions for old buildings, Iowa history, and delicious libations, this is the first time Tim and I have ever got to work together in a professional capacity. So I'm very excited for that. Also, Carolina shared my favorite map of Eastern Iowa. It brings me joy every time I see it. And I'm going to warn you, the first part of my presentation has a lot of dates. I promise once we get through that, there won't be any more dates and no more history class. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and give me just a minute to get that up and in our presentation mode. Okay, how's that looking? Well, I can't see you because it's in presentation mode. So someone will let me know if it's not okay.
I think I need you to share your screen. We are not able to see the presentation yet. Or can people see the presentation? If we can hear from the chat, if you can see the presentation, that would be great. Ah, I see the presentation now.
Okay, is it in full screen format?
Not yet, but now it is. Yes.
Oh, great.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz and
all
Katie.
for your patience too. I would like to start by talking a little bit about this space that we're in, picking up with the territory of Iowa. The United States government first opened the Iowa Territory for settlement by non-native peoples in 1833. That was known as the Black Hawk Purchase. It was overseen by a governing structure in, of all places, Detroit, Michigan. So that was our first capital. We're also going to count capitals today to make it a little more fun. So that was our first capital. Shortly thereafter, in 1836, oversight of the Iowa Territory was transferred to the Wisconsin Territory, and the capital was in Belmont, Wisconsin. That's number 2. On the back of the publication, notes on the Wisconsin Territory, particularly with reference to the Iowa District or Black Hawk Purchase, Lieutenant Albert M. Lee included a large fold-out map of the area in 1835. This is really important for us to be able to reference and to know what Iowa looked like as it was unfolding in 1835, just 2 years after the Black Hawk Purchase opened the areas to white settlers. In 1838, the land became known as the Territory of Iowa with a capital in Burlington. That's 3. The first territorial legislature met there. The legislature quickly decided to move the capital farther west to allow for the burgeoning settlement. Scouting for a new location began in that same year, and a commission was sent out to select a location in Johnson County. That happened in May of 1839. It consisted of Chauncey Swan, John Ronalds, and Robert Ralston, some names that are probably familiar to folks who have spent time in Iowa City. They chose the permanent site for the capital, indicating the placement by driving a slab into the ground where the old capitol now stands. At that time, the only building in sight was a half-finished log cabin. But by the end of July, so that was in May, by the end of July, the town was already laid out, a map had been drawn, people began to buy lots in Iowa City starting in August, and log cabins and frame houses seemed to spring up overnight, and plans for the capital moved rapidly ahead. The work began on the old capitol in 1840, but it did not conclude quickly. The territorial legislature grew impatient and they were anxious to move to Iowa City. So an act was passed in 1841, officially moving the seat of the government if a building was furnished without cost to the territory. Well, these astute businessmen very quickly built a 2-story frame building, and the legislature relocated to Iowa City. We'll call that Capitol 4.1. In 1841, the legislature used the structure for 1 year before moving into a yet unfinished Capitol building. The territorial legislature continued to meet in that stone Capitol, and so that's 4.2. And that remained the capital for over a decade after Iowa became a state. Once Iowa attained statehood, westward expansion continued at a very rapid clip. And by 1857, we see that the capital had moved to Des Moines, first to a brick building. So there's 5.1. And now in what I like to call the new capital, which is 5.2. So there's a quick overview of our territory and early statehood. I'm going to turn it over to Tim now to talk a little bit about our architecture. And let me stop sharing and turn it over.
Okay, I'm getting set up here. Okay, good afternoon. I went ahead and prepared a fairly short essay for today's discussion with slides to illustrate it. I wanted to start with this slide today because we are looking at the architecture and the significance of the Old Capitol as a National Historic Landmark. We are near the 50th anniversary of when the Old Capitol was listed in the National Register of Historic Places. More on that later. The engineering student here is looking at the Old Capitol through a lens, and so we will be too. While much of what I am going to present today may be a review for some, I expect to cover new ground today for many of us as well. I'm hoping not to get too technical, but please feel free to ask questions later in the discussion. As I said, the Old Capitol at the University of Iowa is a National Historic Landmark. This means the building is significant in the history of our nation. But more than that, Old Capitol holds a central place in the history of the UI campus and in the early history of Iowa. It was the first permanent Capitol building at the Iowa Territory and also the first Capitol of the state of Iowa.
Tim, I don't want to interrupt, but
yes.
We can't see your slides.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for interrupting. This is the first slide here. So, and you can see there, they're looking at the Old Capitol through this transit. Okay, as I said, the Old Capitol at the University of Iowa is a National Historic Landmark. This means the building is significant in the history of our nation. But more than that, Old Capitol holds a central place in the history of the UI campus and the early history of Iowa. It was the first permanent Capitol building of the Iowa Territory and also the first Capitol of the state of Iowa. All three of Iowa's constitutional conventions occurred here. The University of Iowa was founded here. The Old Capitol is the original building that the state legislature allocated to the University of Iowa. Renovated in the 1920s with the gilt dome, the Old Capitol has become a visual link to the school color of old gold, as well as an iconic symbol of the university itself. The National Register nomination form reports that the Old Capitol is the most important campus building at the University of Iowa, a symbol of the history of both the university and the state of Iowa. In 1944, Talbot Hamlin, an architect and architectural historian, published a description of the Old Capitol in his book, Greek Revival Architecture in America. He described Old Capitol as a simple but excellently designed building. In 1928, future UI President Willard Boyd described the building as one of the most beautiful buildings in the state. Benjamin Shambaugh, a UI professor who was influential in the study of early Iowa history, stated that the Old Capitol was the most significant monument in the history of Iowa, as well as a work of art radiating the spiritual values of simplicity and dignity, proportion and harmony, poise and tranquility. Professor Margaret Keys, who was nationally recognized and held a PhD in the field of historic preservation, once said that Iowa became a state in this building. Someday it's going to be 300 years old. The Legislative Assembly of the Iowa Territory approved the plans for the Capitol building in December of 1839. Benjamin Shambaugh reports that by this point, ground clearing had been underway since summer. The Legislative Assembly journals indicate that Chauncey Swan was already busy mining limestone while John Ronalds and others began to mill lumber. The financial accounts for the full list of suppliers of materials that went into the old Capitol are extensive and include many local settlers as well as those in other parts of the Iowa Territory. Early in the spring of 1840, a large force of workers under the direction of F Ragu began laying the stone foundation and constructing the basement walls. More than 15 years would pass before the Capitol was in its recognizable form, and the west portico was only finished in the 1920s. The official designer of the old Capitol was John F. Ragu. He was an architect by trade and learned his craft from Leonard Lefevre, who was a builder architect that picked up architectural design through experience and observation while working as a carpenter. Lefevre published 4 well-known pattern books. Pattern books are books with measured drawings depicting elevations and sometimes plans of buildings, and were made by experienced architects for others to use. These books would have demonstrated Lefevre's expertise in the field of architecture. It appears Lefevre's design work focused mostly on private residences and churches. While he worked in many styles, significantly for his influence on F Ragu and the design for the old Capitol, he also worked in the Greek Revival style. Ragu too had a range of styles he worked in, from the flamboyant and eclectic City Hall in Dubuque to the very austere and yet dignified North and South Halls at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Ragu was a good architect in that he appears to have been able to work within budget and provide designs responsive to the needs of his clients. At least 5 works of Ragu are listed in the National Register. It is thought that Ragu was most directly inspired for his design for Old Capitol in Iowa City from his recently completed design for the old Illinois Capitol in Springfield. That building has been said to exhibit the Greek Revival style. The Greek Revival style was a revival of classical architecture that generally took the decorative elements of ancient Greek monumental architecture and applied them to a programmed interior that met the needs of the intended occupants. It is considered by many academics to have been an entirely new style and one that was both unique to the relatively new United States and also emblematic of the ideals of the young democratic republic. Despite the borrowing of classical elements, it is usually not a direct copy of earlier buildings, but instead is a creative mixing of borrowed elements from it with an all-new floor plan. The hallmarks of Greek Revival style are ancient Greek design elements composed with a high degree of symmetry in the plan and the elevations. Most Greek Revival buildings have a forward-facing tympanum, either in a gable or in a portico or other pediment. Within this context, 3 classical architectural orders were used in ornamentation, either together or separately. These are the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The old Capitol, like the old Illinois Capitol, has Doric columns on the first floor and Corinthian in the cupola or lantern. Notably, this arrangement architectural orders reverses the typical order when there are mixed architectural orders in the same building. Usually, the more complex order is on the main floor of the building and simpler orders occur further up. Ragu's basic form for Capitol buildings was clearly within the broad range of popular design of institutional buildings at the time, namely a main rectangular building mass with or without wings and a central dome. In Ragu's case, a lantern inside of columns supporting the dome. It is thought that the precedent for government buildings in this general form was the winning entry for the original design competition for the US Capitol in Washington. That 1793 design was made by William Thornton, an avocational architect and artist who was professionally a physician. The Thornton design has neoclassical design elements that are closest in styling to the Beaux Arts school aesthetics. The Beaux Arts style is an early modern adaptation of classical revivals from the European Renaissance. Central to Thornton's design was the low and fairly simple dome that, along with the pedimented portico in the center of the building, is thought to have been derived from the Pantheon in Rome. As stated, Ragu's 2 Capitol designs have previously been classified as Greek Revival in style. In the case of the old Illinois State House, and possibly with the old Capitol of Iowa, Ragu chose to place a lantern enclosed in a circular structure with columns supporting an entablature and dome. The structure rests on a plinth. At Springfield, that plinth is a short octagon, while in Iowa City, the plinth is square, tall, and has 2 levels. It is generally thought among architectural historians that the inspiration for this structure, the tower with the columns, was adapted from the tragic monument of Lysicrates, located near the base of the Acropolis in Athens, which was constructed in 334 BCE. One of the most prominent and likely the first of the designers to use this theme in American Greek Revival architecture was William Strickland, who designed the Merchants Exchange Building in Philadelphia, and later the Tennessee State House. Merchants Exchange Building, completed in 1836, includes a nearly exact copy of the Lysicrates monument. However, with Ragu's Capitol buildings, there is an octagonal lantern within the circular structure. Ragu appears to have been inspired not only by Thornton and Strickland, but also by earlier state houses and similar buildings with central towers that contain a hexagonal or octagonal lantern as part of the design. These buildings were designed not in the Greek Revival, but in the Georgian style that was popular in late American colonial period and early part of the United States. The Georgian style is a classical revival that was interpreted through the lens of early Renaissance architecture from Italy. As usual, there are new elements in the Georgian style that the British architects added, and these include the multi-paned windows with 6/6 or 9/9 panes of glass, few ornamental flourishes, and pedimented dormers and doorways with straight lines that are topped with an entablature or pediment borrowed from the British Baroque. Original examples of state houses with angular rather than circular lanterns include the Capitol at Williamsburg and the much earlier Christopher Wren building at William and Mary College, also in Virginia. Intriguingly, the suggested appearance for the Iowa Capitol on the 1839 town plat has a strong resemblance to the Capitol at Williamsburg. Before it was actually built, another building likely served as the example. Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which served as the US Capitol until 1800, has a prominent tower topped with an octagonal lantern supported by a large plinth and a balustrade, which is what was built at the old Capitol. As described already, several colonial period buildings have hexagonal or octagonal lanterns, as does the old Capitol, while most Greek Revival or neoclassical Capitol domes have a rounded footprint. Similarly, a large plinth supports the lantern on many Georgian buildings. If there is any further doubt about the colonial influence on Ragu's design of the old Capitol lantern, the plinth that serves as a base to the bell tower is capped in a Renaissance Revival balustrade, a feature that is used in Georgian buildings but is absent in the Greek Revival. How much of the final design can be attributed to Ragu or instead should be attributed to unknown others is impossible to know for certain. What is known is that Ragu fell out with the Iowa Legislative Assembly and the building commissioner in mid-July 1840. Margaret Keys noted that it was over the issue that this fallout was over the issue of the amount and quality of the stone available, as it was described in the Burlington Hawkeye and Iowa Patriot. Others have speculated that it was due to a scrimping legislative assembly or an overbearing building commissioner. All of these are possibly true. What is true is that the subsequent commissioners of the building, Chauncey Swan and William Snyder, took on much of the task of completing the building to a weather-tight and usable state by 1842. Only with subsequent modifications was the final design completed, as porticos were eventually added by the university sometime between 1858 and 1865 to the east, and then during the 1920s on the west. This has been used by some to suggest others were responsible for the final design of the building. Margaret Keys pointed out the masthead of the Iowa Standard, an Iowa City newspaper, featured a drawing of what was supposed to be the old Capitol and the masthead. Some have interpreted this to mean that the designer of the masthead had knowledge of the actual design for the old Capitol. I think that is a stretch. In that drawing, the old Capitol has columns that appear along the full length of the building and a cupola that looks like the one in Springfield. Chimneys project somewhat enigmatically from the front edge of the roof line. Since the cupola of the old Capitol was not complete in 1842, I think the newspaper likely filled in the tentative details for old Capitol from the Springfield building for their artwork. While we are left to speculate whose initial design choices made old Capitol what it is today, it remains possible that Ragu's design was carried out faithfully even after he left. There are some indications in historical documents that this was the intent of the legislature. Even if the commissioners for some reason no longer had access to the Ragu plans, it is known at least Swan had examined them, and a number of workmen on the building were the same people who had worked on the old Illinois State House. Their experience would have aided the work on the old Capitol. While the colonial influence may have only been due to the influence of people other than Ragu, we are similarly We see similar design work at Springfield in terms of the octagonal lantern with a Lysocrates monument. In any event, the final result is a serene and picturesque building that is highly recognizable as a symbol of the University of Iowa. And I will unshare.
And I will unmute and I will begin to share. Thank you very much, Tim, for that. It's always amazing to me how many different architectural styles are actually represented in our building and
Yes.
can be seen, but they all come together so harmoniously. And as you said, in a very serene way. And that is amazing to me. So we heard a lot about the different elements that went into the old Capitol. And Tim touched upon some of my favorite pieces of the story that make it at least a little more interesting to me. John Ragu did leave just a short while into the building of the Capitol, and he took his plans with him. And as Tim highlighted, they had to pick up the pieces. And it's interesting to me because while this continued to be the Capitol from 1846 to 1857, there are many parallelisms between territory and state budgets of that time and state budgets of our time. The original budget for the building was $100,000, which in that time was quite a price. However, the finished building ballooned to the cost of $350,000. This was even after the porticos and ground spiral staircase or ground floor spiral staircase had been eliminated from the project. In this picture, one of the earliest we have of the old Capitol dating to 1853, you'll notice that there is no portico. You'll also notice a fence around what we now recognize as the Pentacrest. That was to keep livestock out, which at that time grazed freely throughout the area. So I always enjoy this photo. So as the building was turned over to the State University of Iowa, our legal name, plans were already in the works for additions. This addition happened sometime in the early 1860s that Tim referred to. And you'll see here we gained the East Portico. We were given the building in 1847 as the university. It was not occupied by the university until 1857. This portico was put on and it became our first home. One of my favorite things about the building that not many people, I guess until today, know is that every building on the university campus is numbered, and the building number of the old Capitol is 0001. And that makes me so happy. Maybe that's the competitive side of me, I don't know. This was our first permanent home. It housed the entire university from 1857 to 1863, and it served in many ways. It provided classrooms, faculty and administrative offices, a chapel, a library, an armory. Those were just a few of the uses that the building served. You can imagine the interior underwent a number of renovations, some of which we have records for, most of which we don't. By 1902, all of the departments of the university, except for the College of Law and the administrative offices, had moved out of the building. The College of Law would move shortly thereafter in 1910. The administrative offices, however, remained in some capacity, including the president's office, until the 1970s restoration. This photo that we're looking at in this picture is a very special one. It was taken on April 19th, 1865, during a period of mourning following the assassination of President Lincoln. If you look closely, you'll see black bunting draping the front of the building, the east facade of the building, and you'll see large crowds gathered in what we now call the Pentacrest. The next major renovation took place in the early 1920s. That was really a very busy period of building and renovations on our campus. Between 1921 and 1924, the old Capitol underwent some major structural renovations. The oak supporting beams were replaced with steel beams. The west portico was constructed. Before I change the slide though, I want you to take a look at that dome and the size of it and make note of it. It's much smaller than the dome that we have today. So pay attention to that. There you see the west portico that was added. And also a view of the interior of the cupola. That is a firewall that was installed during this renovation. It was intended to protect the building from lightning strikes. Many buildings on the university campus had been struck by lightning and did burn to the ground, and university officials did not want this to happen to the old Capitol. And so that false dome was installed. You may think when you are inside looking up through the reverse spiral staircase that what you see is the dome with an ocular window. It is indeed the underside of that false dome with an ocular window and a light installed to replicate daylight. I hope I didn't ruin any of the magic for anyone, but the real dome is a full 2 stories above what we see when we're inside the building. Some other things that happened, the southwest corner of the building's foundation was repaired. It had settled an incredible 8 inches over the subsequent years. And you can see some of the jacks that were used and photos of the process on display in the current exhibit Carolina referenced 175 years on the Pentacrest. Of course, the lovely spiral staircase was renovated. The staircase, the spiral staircase to the ground floor was installed. And this staircase is only one of 3 reverse spiral staircases in the United States. So we're especially fond and very proud of it. I think it's very beautiful. It's the site of many official and wedding photographs, and I'm biased, but they all look beautiful. It's unique in that the top step and the bottom step are directly aligned. That's a very special fact about it too. I'm sorry, let me find my place again. I got busy staring at the staircase. Walter Seeger, who designed the details of the staircase during the 1920 rehabilitation, said that no 2 balusters of the staircase that support the handrail were of the same length. Many of them, I imagine, are very close, but if you've taken a trip up or 2 down the staircase, that's not hard to believe. The 4 columns on the first floor rotunda are the only architectural pieces remaining in the building following all of the university's renovations and remaking of the space. All the other details were stripped out, but restored following a lot of research in the 1970s restoration. There are many, many stories about the staircase. Some of you probably have your own. One of the most famous is about the law students. Their classes met in what we now call the Senate chamber. They would race down the stairs at the conclusion of class, and they would cause it to shake and sway. That worried some people greatly, and it resulted in steel rods, stabilizing rods being added. But what a lot of folks didn't realize was that they were mostly for show. Other renovations in the 20s included the 650-pound crystal and brass chandelier that we now see in the Senate chamber. More than 6,400 3-inch square pieces of gold leaf were applied to the new and larger dome. And we see with the addition of the West Portico that the old Capitol is now complete as the architects, we think, intended. Moving on, well, before we move on to the 1970s renovation, I'd like to talk a little bit about Margaret Keys. We would not be here today talking about this building, I firmly believe, if it had not been for her. Margaret was the daughter of Charles and Sadie Keys and grew up nearby in Mount Vernon. Charles Keys, her father, was a pioneering archaeologist who taught at Cornell College in Mount Vernon and is also considered the father of modern archaeology here in Iowa. So probably from her very earliest childhood, Margaret developed a deep love for the history of this state, which we'll see how that plays out. She had a master's degree in, did we skip this slide? Oh dear, we're out of order. Well, I'll just go on. Margaret held a master's degree in home economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and her PhD, as Tim indicated, from Florida State University. In 1851, she joined the faculty of the Department of Home Economics here at the University of Iowa, retiring from that position 37 years later, but she had some important work to do in the meantime. In 1970, after then President Willard Boyd declared that the remaining administrative offices would vacate the building in preparation for restoration and establishment of the Old Capitol Museum, Margaret Keys was selected to conduct the research and coordinate the needed work, which was significant. In 1977, she was then named director. So here we've seen a picture of the 1970s restoration. This is a picture of the installation of an architectural feature no one knew existed until everything in the interior of the building had been stripped away. There was a viewing loft in the House chamber, and that was where women would watch the proceedings and the activities. Here we see the view from the House chamber. It's a little bit misleading because if you sit in these seats, you cannot see the floor. You can only see the speaker's chair. Also, if you've ever sat in one of these benches, you know immediately how uncomfortable they were. They weren't designed for our 21st century lifestyle, of course. They were designed to accommodate hoop skirts and bustles. The renovations in the 1970s cost $1.6 million, and they came from 4 different sources: gifts from individuals, businesses, and industry via the University of Iowa Foundation. A state appropriation provided a new roof and structural repairs beneath it. Federal grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the National Park Service covered much of the cost, and 2 grants from the Iowa American Revolutionary Bicentennial Commission rounded out those 4 sources. With the contributions and the dedicated work of Professor Keys, the restoration took place and the museum as we now know it was opened. We talked about the House chamber. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about another significant event in the history of the building. That, of course, is the fire. On the morning of November 20th, 2001, a fire broke out in the cupola. Contractors were using a heat gun that was prohibited in their contract to strip decades of paint from the structure. The blaze destroyed the cupola, the dome, and the bell, but was contained by that firewall we saw that had been installed in the 20s. So while it didn't protect the building from lightning, it did indeed protect the building from fire. The fire and the tens of thousands of gallons, reportedly over 50,000 gallons of water used to extinguish it, caused extensive smoke and water damage throughout the building. Fortunately, none of the building's contents were damaged beyond repair. The old Capitol would undergo 4.5 years of repairs and renovations before reopening to the public in 2006. Here is one of my favorite looks at viewpoints of the old Capitol. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with acclaimed Prairie style architect Lloyd Wright. In the late 30s, he visited campus to give a lecture. And at that time, he was quoted in the Daily Iowan as saying, "Forget your sentimentality for the old Capitol, else you are doomed to destruction." Wright was not a fan of the then under development Pentacrest, nor clearly was he a fan of the old Capitol. But I do think that Mr. Wright didn't ever have the opportunity to see the old Capitol in the spring sunshine with students dotting the Pentacrest, or he might feel as I do and agree with Professor Keys when she said that this was in 2006 at the rededication of the old Capitol following the fire. In the years since the 1976 dedication and grand reopening of the old Capitol, the building has changed measurably, yet seems unchanged in spirit. And I do think that as we look at the way that the building has been used over the last 175 years, its spirit definitely remains, even though we use it and access it in wildly different ways than it was originally intended. During that 70s renovation, Keys also sought the historic designation we've mentioned. And the old Capitol is individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was named a National Historic Landmark, and it is also a contributing property to the Pentacrest, which itself is on the National Register of Historic Places. And I can think about a few people better to talk about historic preservation and what it means and why it's important than Tim. So without pause, I'll stop sharing screen and turn it over to Tim.
Okay, I'm getting set up again. Let's see. It's not a terribly important picture, so maybe I'll just go with it.
I can share it.
Oh, okay, here it is.
Okay.
Well, there we are. Okay, so just very briefly, the National Register of Historic Places is a piece of federal legislation that came about in the 1960s, as passed in the 1966, partly due to urban renewal and the raising awareness that we're losing a lot of historic buildings. So, and a lot of this was happening to federal projects. So Congress passed a law that said that there would be the identification, evaluation, and preservation of historic properties for actions done by the federal government. This was then amended and then became included any projects that were advised or funded or otherwise permitted through the federal government to states and private entities. For properties that have national significance, they can become a national historic landmark, and that's what happened with the old Capitol. It's pretty typical that early capitals are national historic landmarks if they still exist. I don't know what else to say about it. The National Register includes buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts. And any of those historic properties can be preserved through that program For homeowners, it means you can get tax credits, or business owners, you can get tax credits. And for everybody else, we get to see this as an honorific, as a special mark of historic significance, because there's a number of criteria you have to go through to get listed. It's not easy.
And I would second that. I've had the opportunity to thumb through the substantial paperwork that it took for all of these different nominations and the placement. And some of those things still govern what we can and can't do to the building today. But ultimately, I think everyone would agree it is for the benefit of our university and local and state community to have the old Capitol as a monument and a place that we can visit. I will do some screen sharing, and hold on just a minute. And we've used and talked about in some of our teasers these fun facts and hidden secrets of the old Capitol. And I wanted to start out with a few. I'll start with the one that we used in our poster and social media promoting this event. A lot of people have written in and asked me, or emailed and asked me, if that cave is one of the tunnels that many folks are familiar with. The Pentacrest is bisected by a number of tunnels, most of them used to supply steam heat and other utilities to various parts of campus. This cave, though, it's not a full tunnel. This is just a vault. I think that's the right name for the style, a barrel vault cave. And it is underneath the front steps of the old Capitol, just to the south of the front entrance. And it's accessed via the men's room. We found it at one point when we noticed this draft in the men's room and investigated to see where it was coming from. And it was coming from essentially what is this chamber. And that chamber was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It wasn't used for storage. We didn't used to keep beer there, although it's not a bad idea some days. You know, none of these really exciting and mysterious purposes. It was really just a factor and a piece of the ventilation of the building. So there was a very complicated means of drawing air up and through. The columns factored into this barrel vault, and some other stonework underneath the front of the structure contributed to that. So the one really interesting thing, though, I think about the ground floor is that it used to be used as a stable. In the early days, the legislators kept their horses there, particularly in the wintertime when it was cold. I think then we have, moving on from that, you'll know I spend a lot of time talking to fourth graders because the rest of my fun facts are all about bathrooms. What we see in this middle picture is Margaret Keys. As we're looking at the picture, Margaret is on our right. She is talking with Susan Hancher, wife of then university president Virgil Hancher, a name that is familiar to all of us. They're talking about this commode and step stool that used to be used in the library during the territorial government days. So before there was indoor plumbing, this commode was used. The old Capitol is the first site of indoor plumbing at the university. The president's office has a very small and discreet closet. That closet we now use for storage. The presidents at the time used it. There was a very small toilet and a very small sink and a tiny little mirror installed. And so they had benefited from the first indoor plumbing. Tim also has a plumbing story about the third picture.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was it was called the water closet. It was the university water closet. And I wrote that blog that was posted by the Pentacrest Museums. And This building was the first formal bathroom on campus. It had running water and only men could use it.
The women had to go. It was the women's equivalent was closer to Clinton Street, wasn't it?
It was in the North Hall.
Oh, North Hall.
The
Oh,
basement of North Hall.
Yeah. So this water closet stood about where McLean Hall stood, kind of in that space between.
North edge of McLean, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, in that space between the building. But that was before McLean was there.
Right.
So, yeah. Plumbing and bathroom stories surrounding the old Capitol abound. I think, though, we have a few minutes left. Should we turn it over to, I'll stop sharing. Should we turn it over to our audience for their questions or comments? Or I'm sure everyone here has some stories that they could share too.
Yes, Liz, we do have a couple of questions coming in. Katie has been kind to submit a couple questions. We could start with one of her questions. Was a time capsule ever placed in the old building? I see Tim nodding. Do you want to take this one, Tim?
Oh, well, I'm sure Liz can do it too. They in the cornerstone, they placed a time capsule, and Ragu's name was put in there as the architect of the building, among other things. I'm not sure what.
We know what was in it. There's this is a great plug to visit the exhibition. We talk about the time capsule in the exhibition. We have a timeline of events, and the things that were placed in it were outlined. There were some newspapers, of course, that was a fairly common content of the time capsule, and some other items of the day. Nothing really earth-shattering, all the usual things.
Yep.
Thanks for sharing that.
And that was uncovered. We know what was
yes,
in there because it was open during the 20s renovations.
Oh,
that was
true.
The corner where the cornerstone was placed was actually the corner of the building that had sunk those 8 inches, and so required extensive repairs.
So I want to make sure, were there any other unusual items that were discovered during multiple renovations? You talked about this being covered. Katie asks, follows up on that one.
I think one of the most amazing things to me, and it was a story that Mary Bennett of the State Historical Society of Iowa Research Center, just down the street on Iowa Avenue. Mary shared this with me, and I had just seen a picture of it earlier in the day, or earlier in that same week when we were doing some research. When everything was stripped out, Mary was a student at the university at the time. When everything was stripped out of the building, they uncovered on the floor of the second floor a sketch of the stair. So a hand-drawn pencil sketch of the design for the floor. And I had just seen that picture earlier in the day, and I thought that must have been incredible to have taken out whatever flooring covered it up and to find that original drawing from 1841. How incredible that would be.
That is. Thank you for answering that. Katie, we're so grateful to all your questions. They're wonderful. I think in homage to Margaret Keys, Katie asks, does the University of Iowa still have a home economics department?
No, we don't. It was on the, my office is not in the old Capitol. My office is in McBride Hall. It used to be the Department of Home Economics, used to be on the second floor of McBride Hall in the south end of the building. So every day, Margaret looked out over the old Capitol while she was in her office in the Department of Home Economics. So at the building that she one day would restore.
That's great. And towards the end of this presentation, when I share out some resources that you can learn more, I will share that photo of Margaret Keys that Liz was trying to show.
Oh, thank you.
So
yes, I don't know what that slide completely disappeared.
That's okay. I want to also thank Matthew, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, has a question. Can anyone update us on the status of San Xe Gilmore House re-preservation landmark status? I am sorry, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but
the Saxony House. I bet, Tim, do you know the most recent development on that?
Well, I was reading a little bit about it. and the university was going to move it, and then they've decided it will stay in place, and as long as it can be used and funded in place, it's going to stay there, I guess, and unless they find another use for the property.
I do know that in some of the readings I've done about the home, which I learned some of the same limestone that was used to build the old Capitol was used in the foundations and lower parts of that house. Oh, I see a question. Oh, Mary, I see Mary Bennett is here and part of the audience. Hi, Mary. I see there's a question about the exterior of the structure. The windows, limestone, etc., require much maintenance. Oh my goodness. That's a whole nother exhibition spotlight. Yes, it does. If you're in the area right now, you've probably seen the scaffolding going up. That's to help facilitate the replacement of the gilt on the dome. It did not last as long as anticipated. It had a much shorter lifespan than planned. So we find ourselves replacing it now. That's a project that should be done in about 8 weeks, we hope. So we'll have our dome back all shiny and new. The building does require some very special maintenance. You know, it's limestone and it's pretty sturdy. That part of it, there's a special kind of caulking and other sorts of things that we do because limestone is very porous, right? It's often found as a filter for aquifers. So limestone itself is very porous. So the stone is really, I think of it as a living component of the building in the same way that the wooden components absorb and give off water as the humidity in Iowa changes, which it does a lot. The paint that's on the columns and much of the exterior is a sand paint so that these components resemble stone. They're not stone. The columns and much of the exterior of the building that isn't limestone is wooden and painted then to look like stone. And so that takes some special conservation. The windows also, the windows are, Tim mentioned different styles of window and referred to the 8/8 or 6/6. Our windows are 12/12. If you look at the photo of, well, I point at it, but you guys can't see that. If you, let me see if I can do it backwards.
There you go.
If you, oh, but I lose my finger.
Yeah.
So if you look at the windows behind me, you'll see there are 2 sashes, or the windows are divided into 2 larger sections, and each of those sections are divided into 12. So every window, and there are 68 of them, involves 24 panes of glass. And so we are at a point where we find that we need to reglaze some of that. I really want to wash the windows, but they need some repair before that can happen. And we've also found that the paint that was used during we think the 70s restoration contained lead, which was not uncommon at that time. And it also contains asbestos, which is a little less common, but is probably also one of the reasons that it's lasted for nearly 50 years. But that paint is needing to be replaced. And so we'll have to go through some very specific restoration processes to abate those chemicals and restore the windows. So
I think it's, if I may, Liz, I think it's interesting they talk about the preservation and the continued conservation efforts for this building, in addition to the regilding that is currently happening. You might see scaffolding right now. The old Capitol is the largest object in our collection, just FYI. So a little fun fact, it is considered a collection object, and therefore we need to continue to preserve it to last forever.
It is accessioned.
Yes, it is accessioned. We have only time for maybe one more question, and if panelists have time to spend a couple minutes afterwards, I do have some closing remarks, very brief. I want to at least let this next question come in. Was there a rededication ceremony in 1976? Matthew asks. As a local elementary student, I recall giving an oral presentation.
There was a grand opening and dedication, and there was another that followed then in 2006. That 1976 reopening as the Old Capitol Museum. It was on the 4th of July. And so you can imagine the event and other programming that took place around that. It was really something else. The photos it was a big party.
It's great to hear that, because not that long ago, actually, I was born in 1976, so it's in a memory.
There you go. There you
And
go.
also, we should look out for the 250th anniversary of the United States. We will likely do something big
There's
and great.
a pretty good chance.
Yeah, we're gonna have something special for that time coming up.
But we didn't. We didn't share the resources. The other
I
resources.
will. Yes,
slide.
that's what I want to
Okay.
do at this time. So I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right. And while I share my screen, maybe you can answer the quick question by Katie: how far up can most people go in the building?
The second floor. So that second row of windows that you see, the stairwell. Well, there's our picture. That's one of my favorite pictures of Margaret. I just adore it. She's standing on the staircase, and I just adore it. So we only have access to the first 2 floors, well, the ground floor, the first floor, and the second floor. So visitors cannot go past the floor which contains the Senate chamber and the House chamber. After the fire, it's, I would say, an easier trip up to the dome. It's 2 stories. So when you are on the second floor, you have to imagine there are 2 more stories above you. They're accessed through very narrow and steep ladder style stairs. So it's very similar to a ship style. I wouldn't even call them a staircase. They're more like ladders. And you have to be very comfortable in small and confined spaces, because there are some very tight squeezes around some of the other mechanicals. The firewall takes up a lot of space. And so it's amazing though, once you get to the top.
Yeah.
The view of Iowa City is really beautiful. The view down Iowa Avenue to Woodlawn at the end of Iowa Avenue is really lovely. So if someone ever offers to give you a tour of it, take it. We also did a virtual tour during our period of closure to give folks an opportunity to see what it's like up there. And maybe someday, if there's interest, we could revisit that.
Yeah, and actually, there's some additional information I want to share. This is some of the resources that both Tim and Liz put together to share out. In my, I will follow up with all registrants on these resources and links. And excited as well, because Liz recently presented for PBS Iowa in a show dedicated to the Old Capitol. So there's some more information you can learn about this amazing building at the heart of campus.
And I saw some folks in the comments shared images from the Iowa Digital Library. That's an incredible resource.
Oh, yes.
For people who are interested in older photos of Iowa City. I think it's called the Town and Campus Collection.
Iowa City Town and Campus, yeah.
There we go. Extensive collection of Fred Kent, who was a prolific photographer, both for the community and the university. Just down the street, Mary Bennett is a great resource at the State Historical Society of Iowa Research Center. And then the 2 books that we talked about during the presentation. Really the Handbook of the Old Capitol is the Portrait of an Iowa Landmark by Margaret Keys. That's usually our definitive source for most things.
The Old Stone Capitol is mostly history behind the building and how it was built and what happened around Iowa City during that time period.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm just going to add a few more plugins for our program. This isn't the last exhibition spotlight that we're going to have regarding the 175th Then and Now exhibition companion programs. We're going to have one in the fall on archaeology and other future programs. So look out on the website. I'm going to have my assistant Joey share some links to that. And also we have some things coming up both this summer. Our tree tours, which is our most recent addition to programs, and in collaboration with Live Well on campus, we want to provide incredible, the incredible stories behind the trees on campus as an official arboretum. With over 8,000 trees and 300 species. I give a tour once a month, and as it changes all the time because it's a seasonal thing, right? And these will go once a month all the way up till October. So please join me in these wonderful wellness-based and history slash symbolism slash unique stories that we have here at the University of Iowa through our trees. And also once a month, we host a special program in Byrd and Iowa Hall. It's called Art and Write Night, where you can come if you're interested in writing or drawing or any creative form. You are welcome to express yourself right here in our galleries. And we have a community gallery at the end of each of those nights that everybody gets to share with one another. It's a wonderful way to experience the museum and to meet others that have equal interests. So please join us for these and other upcoming programs. We're so glad you can join us today.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Stop sharing, yeah, so everybody can see.
And we only went over by 5 minutes. In our practice session, I think we went over by 45. So I'm feeling really proud.
We're so glad. Thank you both, Tim and Liz, for joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
I'm gonna stop recording now.